A contractor named Franklin Harper was the first to descend into the chamber. He wasn't the kind of man who frightened easily. 30 years in restoration work will carve the nerves out of you, layer by layer. Black mold, snakes in attics, a corpse or two hidden behind the drywall of old estates. But nothing had ever prepared him for what he found under the Ashbrook Church in Richmond, Virginia. The trap door had been hidden beneath rotted cedar boards. No hinges, no latch, just a jagged square sealed tight with decades of paint, as if someone had been trying to keep whatever was down there from ever breathing again. Franklin had to pry it open with a crowbar, coughing through the clouds of dust and fungal spores that exploded into the air. The smell hit first. Not rot, not death. Sweetness, like dried flowers left too long in a locked room. Something perfumed, but wrong. The opening revealed a short wooden ladder, eaten through in places but still passable. Beneath that, only darkness. A heavy, humid kind of silence. Franklin shone his flashlight into the gloom and muttered, "Hell of a crawl space." It wasn't a crawl space, it was a bricked-in chamber. No more than 7 feet wide, perhaps 9 deep. The walls were smooth, too smooth. No mortar lines, just cold, gray stone, slick with condensation. There were no markings, no shelves, no objects, except for her. In the corner, curled like she had tried to make herself disappear into the wall, was the skeletal figure of a young woman. One ankle was cuffed to an iron ring embedded in the floor. The bones had not been disturbed. Her wrists still crossed gently over her chest. Her long, once white dress was intact in places, yellowed by time. There were no signs of trauma, no violence, just stillness. The calm arrangement of someone who had not fought the end, but waited for it. In her palm lay a slip of parchment, a torn hymn, written in looping script. The ink faded, but legible. Let my chains be the verse, and my silence the song. No name, no date. But the fabric of her collar bore stitched initials, E.L. Eleanor Lovell, the daughter of Reverend Elijah Lovell, missing since 1878. Official records had called it a runaway. Some whispered it was suicide. Others said she had eloped in secret. No one expected to find her here, less than 20 feet beneath the very altar where her father once preached fire and brimstone. And yet there she was, buried not in the soil, but in the house of God. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, you're not here by accident. Like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell, because what we're about to uncover will lead you to places most history books were paid to forget. Now, let's go back. Back to the weeks before the doors of Ashbrook were sealed. Back to the nights when the townsfolk still saw Eleanor in the window, watching them, unmoving. Her hair unpinned, her eyes strange. Let's begin with the man who built the prison, and called it a home. Reverend Elijah Lovell arrived in Richmond in the fall of 1857. A tall man with thin lips and a sharper tongue. He'd come from Baltimore after a quiet falling out with his former church. No scandal, no articles, just a swift, polite departure. A pattern he would repeat. He married quickly, a timid woman named Grace who seemed to vanish into the corners of every room. They had one child, Eleanor. She was everything the congregation hoped she would be. Soft-spoken, gentle, musical. Her voice during Sunday hymns could still a restless room. Mothers pressed their children to listen. Men paused their coughing. The elderly wept without knowing why. But there was something else, something quieter. Eleanor never smiled for long. And when she did, it was as if she was remembering how, rather than meaning to. She walked with a grace that unnerved the other girls her age, and she rarely spoke unless spoken to. What no one saw, not even her mother, was that Eleanor's nights were not her own. In the attic, beneath the rafters, she kept a journal, not in English, Latin, with diagrams, notes on dreams, symbols that no one taught her. She wrote of a place behind her eyes, a music she hadn't learned but always knew, a voice that hummed through the bones of the old Ashbrook organ. And she wasn't afraid. She was waiting. By the winter of 1877, people began whispering about the girl. She'd stopped attending Sunday socials. Her hair was left unbrushed, her sleeves stained with ink. Once, a child claimed Eleanor had stood outside their window for hours, unmoving in the snow. No footprints were ever found beneath the sill. Then the music began. At night, when no one was inside the church, the organ would sound. Soft at first, then louder, always the same pattern, 5 notes. A pause, then 11. Minor key. A spiral, not a song. Eleanor claimed she didn't know how it was happening, but her father knew better. He had heard it before. Long ago in Baltimore. Before the quiet falling out. Before the girl named Marianne Harris was found wandering barefoot into the bay, murmuring verses no one recognized. He had left that city behind, and now it had followed him. He believed Eleanor had been marked, not possessed, chosen, and Reverend Lovell believed one thing above all: if a vessel opens, it must be sealed. What no one could have guessed is how far he would go, because what looked like chains was his version of mercy. And Eleanor? She never asked to be free, and she asked to be remembered. Next, we'll look at the diary pages, the ones that wrote themselves, and the lullaby that made people forget their own names. Because this wasn't just imprisonment, it was inheritance. The diary was kept in a cedar box beneath a loose board in the attic floor. It had no lock, no clasp, just twine knotted 3 times around the aged leather cover. When it was finally opened, decades later, it smelled faintly of wax and lilac, as if it had absorbed the perfume of its writer's skin. The first pages were dated 1873, when Eleanor Lovell was 17. They began innocently, February 2nd. Father says I should not let my mind wander. I told him the melody comes before thought, before words. He was angry. He does not hear it, so he calls it temptation. But I know now it is neither voice nor devil. It is memory, and it is mine. Most of the early entries describe hymns, routines, the isolation of being a minister's daughter in a town that turned courtesy into distance. But the writing changes tone quickly. March 17th. I dreamed of the cellar again. This time, there was no trapdoor, just a circle of salt and my name written backward on the wall. I woke humming. My fingers smelled of copper. I had scratched lines into the headboard. I think I was writing the rhythm in my sleep. There were no signs of self-harm, no mention of rebellion, only a rising sense of duality, like she lived in a house that shifted when others weren't looking. At times, she referred to herself in the third person. She heard it again tonight. 5 notes, then 11. She followed it with her fingers on the window pane. It fogged the glass. When her father knocked, the song stopped, but the silence stayed hot. By summer, Eleanor's music had changed, not in composition but in effect. People who heard her play described strange feelings. One woman collapsed in church and later claimed she'd remembered her stillborn son's face for the first time in 20 years. Another man refused to attend services, saying the melody forced him to relive a sin he'd buried in war. Reverend Lovell forbade Eleanor from playing alone. She stopped using the organ, but the music did not stop. Neighbors reported hearing it echoing faintly through the woods at night, always the same progression. 5 notes, 11 notes. Silence. Then breath, not wind, breath. Eleanor's diary confirmed their fears, but not in the way they expected. August 12th. I watched the window not from inside but from the outside. In my dream, the house was empty. Father had left. The church bell rang, but no one heard it. Still, I felt the pews fill. Not with people, but with memory. I played without keys. The music curled around the rafters like smoke. Her entries became increasingly symbolic. She began drawing spirals, perfect mathematical spirals, in the margins, always turning inward. In one particularly disturbing passage, she described opening her mouth and releasing not sound but dust from before breath. October 3rd. I stood before the mirror. My reflection blinked before I did. It hummed, not a melody, a warning. I mouthed, "Where are you keeping me?" It mouthed back, "I am keeping you in time." It wasn't just dreams. One morning, Grace Lovell, Eleanor's mother, was found seated at the kitchen table, her hands folded, her expression blank. She was alive, but her speech was gone. She never spoke again. Reverend Lovell called it divine silence, a lesson in humility. But Eleanor wrote something else. Mother saw it too, the shape in the pew, the shadow that leans left. It showed her the song, and then it took her voice, not in punishment, in exchange. That fall, Eleanor stopped attending church. Instead, she sat beneath the bell tower, sketching lines that resembled old musical notation, but no one could read them. When approached, she would ask a single question. "Do you hear it too?" Most said no. A few paused before answering. One man, a visiting scholar named Franklin Vane, was the only one who spoke up publicly. He approached Reverend Lovell after a sermon and claimed the melody was a variation of a pre-Reformation exorcism chant, transposed to a minor key. He vanished 3 days later. His satchel was found in the woods behind the church, hanging from a branch. Inside were pages of music, scorched at the edges, and a note that read, "It's not a hymn. It's a memory of what music was before we invented language." After Vane's disappearance, Reverend Lovell shuttered the chapel indefinitely. He said it was for repairs. He said Eleanor was unwell. But the townsfolk knew better. One child swore he saw her standing in the belfry window, arms outstretched, lips moving in silence as the bell rang without a hand on the rope. Another boy, Thomas Winrow, claimed Eleanor visited him in his dreams. She wore a chain of feathers and told him, "The sermon is underneath." He stopped speaking and refused to enter any building with a cross on it. Eleanor's final diary entry, dated November 11, 1878, was one sentence. "He knows I don't blame him." Then the diary ends. But the chains were real. Rust analysis confirmed they were forged in the late 1870s. Hand-wrought, customized to fit a slender ankle. The padding inside the cuff was made from altar linen, and the wall? That stone wasn't original to the church. It had been reinforced from inside the chamber. There was no latch on the trap door, no way to open it from within. She had not been placed there quickly. She had been sealed. But for what? Theories flooded local newspapers after the discovery in 1925. Cult rituals, madness, abuse. One even claimed Eleanor had suffered from musical hallucinations brought on by syphilis, a diagnosis thrown at nearly every 19th century woman who resisted obedience. But her writings were clear. The music had not come from her. It came through her. And that's where things deepen. Because in 1974, a group of musicologists stumbled upon an unpublished collection of Appalachian folk hymns from the 1800s. Among them was one titled The Remembering Spiral. It bore no composer's name. Its melody, 5 notes, 11, silence, then breath, and written faintly in pencil just above the clef was a name, E.L. Next, we'll step into the night she vanished, and the man who watched it all, but never opened the door. The last known sighting of Eleanor Lovell came from a woman named Miss Henrietta Giles, a spinster seamstress who lived across from the Ashbrook Church and kept a habit of sewing by candlelight near her second-floor window. Her testimony, recorded decades later in a faded journal found in the attic of her niece's home, reads, "She was standing under the bell tower, still as frost. White dress, no cloak, hair like ink poured down her back. I watched her for over an hour. She never moved, just watched the church doors like she was waiting for someone to open them from the inside. But they didn't, and the bell rang. Though I swear on my life, I saw no one pull the rope." That was the night of November 14th, 1878, the night Reverend Lovell announced that Eleanor had taken ill and was being sent to live with a distant family in Staunton for her health. A carriage had been arranged, her belongings packed, her room cleaned out by dawn. Except no carriage was ever seen, no coachman was ever named, and no family from Staunton ever claimed her. For over a year, letters from townsfolk were sent, inquiring about Eleanor. All returned undeliverable. Eventually, the questions stopped. The Lovells were not a family, one pressed. The Reverend continued preaching, thinner, quieter. His wife, Grace, remained inside their home. Her condition never improved. But Thomas Winrow, the boy who stopped speaking after Eleanor's visitation, left behind drawings. His mother found them stuffed under his mattress, 20 pages of a church, identical from every angle. But in the drawings, the church always had a window that didn't exist in real life. A small circular one, near the ground, covered in vines. When builders reopened the foundations decades later to stabilize the chapel, they found that window exactly where Thomas had drawn it. It had been sealed with bricks from the inside. Behind it, a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel, the chamber. But that wasn't the only thing they found. Along the walls of the passageway, burned into the stone like a brand, were handprints. Small, thin, as if someone had walked the passage over and over, their fingertips etching into the stone by touch alone. And in the dirt, underneath a pile of rotted hymnals, lay a cracked music box. It still played. Not well, but clearly. 5 notes, 11, silence. Then a mechanical creak, like breath. That night in 1878, before the disappearance, strange things were reported all across Richmond. Livestock were found huddled against fences, their ears pressed flat. Candles in homes flickered at the same moment. Just before the church bell rang twice, then once, then twice again. A woman walking near the cemetery claimed she heard children humming from underground. A constable assigned to the Western District later admitted he refused to approach Ashbrook after seeing a light in the belfry that didn't belong to oil, fire, or God. But the most disturbing account came from a janitor named Desmond Fry, who had once worked under Reverend Lovell before being dismissed for drunkenness. He gave a single interview to the Richmond Tribune in 1891, while dying of tuberculosis. "I saw her. I did that night. The Reverend told me not to come, but I had keys. I wanted to say goodbye. She was in the chapel, not crying, just humming. She said something I can't forget. He's almost done building it. The inside has to fit the sound." I thought she meant the church. Now I know she meant the place under it. Desmond claimed he was then grabbed from behind by 2 men, church elders, and thrown out. The next morning, the entrance was sealed. That very same day, Eleanor was declared safely relocated, and no one ever saw her again. But years later, when the chamber was discovered and Eleanor's remains were confirmed, an unexplainable detail emerged. Her vocal cords were missing. Not degraded, not damaged. Gone. As if surgically removed long before the rest of her body had decomposed. And her fingers, every one of them, had been bent backward and reset, healed, then broken again, as if forced into a new shape. Some claimed this was consistent with certain practices of 19th century restraint, but others saw something else. A pattern. Because Eleanor had been drawing spirals, practicing unnatural postures, writing melodies that weren't meant to be sung. The prevailing theory? She had been trying to reshape herself into an instrument. Not metaphorically, literally. A vessel. One that could produce a sound from beyond the human throat. One not meant for human ears. But the most damning evidence came from an envelope found inside Reverend Lovell's desk, locked and untouched since his death. It bore no address, only the words, "To the one who hears it too." Inside was a folded note. "I could not destroy her. I could only close the door. She is not lost. She is not dead. She is paused. And if this ever opens again, may it not be music that wakes her, but mercy." It was signed simply E.L., but not Eleanor. The signature matched the Reverend's known hand. He had taken her initials, used them as his own, as if he had buried not just his daughter, but part of himself. Next, we look at the revival attempt in 1932, when Ashbrook Church was reopened, and the first sermon triggered something they couldn't explain. A congregation that heard nothing, except the choir, even though no one was singing. They reopened Ashbrook Church on a warm spring morning in 1932. The town had changed, modernized, rebuilt itself after the war. But the church had stood untouched since 1879, sealed like a tomb in the center of a place that had long learned to look away from its own shadow. A new pastor had come, sent from Philadelphia, young, eager, and ambitious, Reverend Joseph Keene. He claimed not to know the full story of Eleanor Lovell, nor of the circumstances surrounding the old church's closure. But he was warned, quietly, respectfully, by the barber, the librarian, even the woman who poured his coffee. They all said the same thing: let sleeping saints lie. Keene ignored them. He scrubbed the floors, replaced the broken windows, even polished the pulpit himself. And on May 8, 1932, he rang the bell for the first time in 54 years. The rope snapped after 3 tolls. It didn't break from age or fray. It tore clean, sheared at the anchor point in the belfry. Some took it as a sign. But the congregation came anyway, dozens of them, curious, skeptical, lured by nostalgia and novelty. The pews were filled by 10 a.m. Keene began his sermon with confidence. He read from Psalm 98. "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all the earth. Make a loud noise and rejoice and sing praise." That was when it started. Softly, in the walls. A harmony that didn't match any song they'd sung before. Not quite human, not quite wind. A low, curling hum that settled under the floorboards like a breath held too long. No one mentioned it aloud. No one moved. But the children began to cry. 3 toddlers, seated near the front, erupted into sobs at the exact same moment. Their parents could not calm them. One boy clutched his ears. Another girl began clawing at her mother's dress, saying, "It's too many mouths." Reverend Keene tried to continue, but his own voice began to warp, subtly, then dramatically. His words slowed, elongated, then echoed, even though he wasn't mic'd, and there was no acoustic structure to account for it. He turned pale. The choir behind him had not sung a note, but the congregation heard voices, dozens of them, rising in the rafters, singing something cold and spiraled. 5 notes, 11. Silence, breath. One man, a veteran named Milton Avery, stood up and screamed, "Make it stop! That's not music!" He collapsed in the aisle. By the time the service ended, 5 people had fainted. 2 required medical care, and no one, not one person, could recall the content of the sermon. Only the sound, that horrible, echoing, unfinished song. The church was closed again the next day, but something had been disturbed, because that night a child went missing. 8-year-old Clara Ray Grimsley, daughter of the florist, vanished from her bedroom without a trace. The window was locked from the inside. Her shoes were still by the door, her hairbrush on the pillow. All that remained was a single drawing on the floor, a spiral made of tiny, feather-like strokes, and beneath it, written in charcoal, the song finished itself. Police searched for weeks. Dogs couldn't trace her scent past the chapel. Locals formed search parties. The forest was scoured. Nothing. Until June 1st, when her voice was heard. A group of boys exploring the cemetery near the church claimed they heard someone humming beneath the ground. They described the sound as too steady and wrongly happy. One boy, Emmett Coker, put his ear to a grave near the rear gate. It wasn't Clara Ray's, it was Eleanor Lovell's. He swore he heard Clara say, "She's showing me the long version." The boys fled. Their parents forbade them from speaking further, but the humming continued. Each Sunday morning at 10 a.m., the same time Keene had begun his first sermon, the sound returned. First faint, then stronger. Always those same notes, always with breath at the end. People stopped walking near Ashbrook altogether. But Keene stayed. He began researching in private. Old files, dusty hymnals, band compositions. He visited libraries in 3 states, looking for a match to the melody. He wrote to composers and theologians. One response came from a man named Ernest Moeller, a music theorist based in Vienna. Moeller had encountered similar notations in a fragment recovered from a burned abbey in Salzburg. He called it the spiral voice, a form of tonal recursion believed to induce spiritual trance or madness. He warned Keene not to replicate the melody, but Keene already had. He had been playing it nightly in the chapel, on a pipe organ he'd personally restored. He believed it could unlock something. He believed Eleanor Lovell had composed the world's first nonlinear hymn, a musical structure that remembered the listener's sins, played them back as harmony, and judged them based on how they listened. Keene recorded a wax cylinder of his attempts. The final recording, marked in his hand as Attempt 12, was recovered after his disappearance. The audio begins with quiet organ tones. Normal. Measured. But 2 minutes in, a second voice enters, soft, lilting, but undeniably female. She sings no words, just breath arranged like melody. Then, a third voice, deeper, slower. It doesn't sing, it asks. And Keene replies, not in speech, in notes, back and forth. Until, without warning, Keene begins weeping into the recording horn. His last audible words, "I didn't mean to open the door, but it remembers me." The tape ends in static. Keene was never seen again. The church has remained closed ever since. But every 10 years, without fail, on the anniversary of that first sermon, someone claims to hear the hymn in a dream. Always the same progression. 5. 11. Silence. Breath. Some wake with nosebleeds. Others claimed to see a girl in their mirror, braided hair, chain around her ankle, eyes closed, but mouthing a song they've never heard. Next, we uncover what was beneath the chapel's foundation, a second chamber, older than the church, carved not by tools, but by hands, marked not by saints, but by students. The first account of the second chamber came not from an architect or a historian, but from a boy named Lionel Chase, 12 years old, too curious for his own safety, and the grandson of a groundskeeper who tended the Ashbrook Cemetery long after the church had been sealed. It was 1956 when Lionel found the tunnel. He had been chasing a rabbit between the gravestones when he slipped on loose earth near the old chapel wall. What he fell into wasn't a rabbit hole. It was a breach. A thin opening beneath a cracked tomb slab, barely wide enough for a child. He wriggled inside, called for his grandfather who was out of earshot. Inside, it was cold, not damp, cold like breath against bone. He described a narrow descent carved entirely by hand. Notched finger grooves lined the walls, as if dug by those who had no tools, no light, and no intention of leaving. He crawled 20 feet before reaching a chamber just tall enough to stand in. There were no pews, no altar, just concentric rings of stone benches, like a classroom that taught inward. At the very center, a circle of worn-down wood slats. Beneath them, dirt that didn't match the soil above. Fine, black, and powdery, like the remains of ash that had never fully cooled. And in the center of that, a small iron collar still bolted into the ground. Lionel didn't understand what he'd found, but he remembered what happened next for the rest of his life. The room began to hum. Not loud, but present, like something exhaling through the floor. Then, without warning, a note, just one, sang out of the stone. He didn't know how to describe it, so he drew it when he returned home. A spiral of ink that tightened toward the center, ending in what he simply labeled her. His grandfather beat him bloody that day, told him never to speak of it again. The breach was filled with rocks that same night, cemented over. But Lionel, at 16, tried to return. He failed, but his obsession never waned. At 24, he became a music student at the University of Virginia. His senior thesis was titled Spiral Harmonics and the Memory of Sacred Structures. It included no bibliography, just sketches, diagrams, a melody repeated in variations, each with a cryptic title. Track 7 was called The Minister's Daughter Taught Backward. The university failed him. His paper was confiscated. 2 weeks later, he vanished. His apartment was empty, save for one thing. A gramophone, still spinning, playing a recording etched onto a wax disc with the words, "I stayed too long at the center." That was the first time scholars linked the chamber to something older than Ashbrook Church itself. An anthropologist named Dr. Miriam Langley later examined aerial surveys of the property. What she noticed chilled her. The layout of Ashbrook, its foundation lines, bell tower, and even the cemetery gates, when overlaid with Lionel's spiral, matched exactly. The church wasn't built on sacred ground. The church was built to contain something already there. Langley's full report was never published, but in a leaked letter to a colleague she wrote, "We've misunderstood what Ashbrook was for. It wasn't a place of worship, it was an amplifier. The entire structure is a resonant body, tuned not to divinity, but to memory. And not our memory, hers. The chain in the chamber wasn't for binding. It was for tuning. To keep the girl, whoever, whatever she'd become, at a frequency that could be managed. That wouldn't leak into the minds of the living, But when Reverend Lovell buried her, he broke that frequency, and when Keene rang the bell, he restarted it. Everything after that, Clara Ray's disappearance, the voices in the wall, the harmonic seizures of the congregation, were symptoms, like fever or tremors, proof that the tuning had failed, and that she was learning to sing again. The most terrifying discovery came from an old Ashbrook ledger, found wedged behind the false back of a drawer in the sacristy. Written in Eleanor's handwriting, confirmed by multiple analysts, was a list of names, 86 of them, and next to each, one word, taught. Not saved, not healed, taught. The implication was horrific. Eleanor, or whatever inhabited her, had not died in chains. She had been teaching in them, through them, and whoever listened long enough began to echo what she had become. Ashbrook wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was infected, and the infection was auditory. Those who stayed long enough didn't see things, they heard them, in music, in whispers, in familiar voices twisted with impossible notes, and once they heard it, they couldn't unhear it. Langley's letter ended with a warning. If anyone else finds the chamber, do not enter, do not speak, do not hum, leave immediately, and if you hear the 5-note call, do not echo it. That is how she finds your tone. That is how she begins to teach you. After that, no further expeditions were made. The land was bought by the city and declared structurally unsound. But locals say on quiet nights, especially when the wind is still, you can hear it through the grates. 5 notes, 11. Silence. Then breath. Next, we examine the surviving letters of Grace Lovell, Eleanor's mother, found hidden behind the wallpaper of her bedroom. In them, a descent into madness, or confession, and a final horrifying account of what Eleanor called her voice lessons. The letters began as a mother's mourning. Neat cursive, faded ink. The first dated March 4th, 1879, just 2 days after Eleanor was buried beneath Ashbrook Church. They've told me not to write, not to remember, but the silence is a wound that only deepens, so I will write, for her, for what's left of me. Grace Lovell had locked herself inside the parsonage attic. No visitors, no sermons, no sound, but her letters suggest otherwise. She taps sometimes, not to haunt, to correct, as if she hears my prayers and finds them wrong. Grace described the sound as rhythm without music, the pattern of a teacher clapping for silence. But sometimes at night it changed, became melodic but fractured, like a hymn half-remembered by a dying throat. Last night she hummed again. I opened the Bible, and every verse spoke of mouths. Open not thy lips. Their tongue walketh through the earth. The cry of them is waxed great. I closed it, and the sound got louder. One letter, dated March 11th, 1879, held a sketch. A crude drawing of Eleanor's face. But the mouth was missing. In its place, a circle with 5 spokes. Beneath it, Grace wrote, "This is not my child's silence. It is someone else's patience." She began hearing sermons that were never preached. Waking to the sound of pews shifting, organs rising, chains dragged across the wooden floor beneath the chapel. But no one else heard it. She begged her husband, Reverend Lovell, to reopen the grave, to test the soil, to listen beneath it. He refused, called her unwell, accused her of spiritual hysteria. So she turned to writing. If she is there, if any part of her remains, I will be the anchor. I will remember her sound before they changed it. She began recording Eleanor's childhood habits, her voice, her songs, but slowly the tone of the letters shifted. Less about Eleanor, more about the notes, about sequences, rhythms that could change thought. She wrote, "There's a way to speak without speaking, a cadence that bypasses understanding and rewrites obedience. I think she found it, or it found her." By April, the ink became erratic. Sentences looped. She'd repeat phrases, sometimes whole paragraphs in different sequences, like trying to find the right order of verses in a song. One letter simply read, "Her voice does not echo. It plants, and now it grows in me." Another included a list, not names, commands. Hold the breath between fourth and fifth note. Hum only after silence, never before. Eyes must remain closed until the return. Chains are tuning forks, not prisons. The final letter, dated April 30th, was never sent. It was hidden behind a torn piece of wallpaper in Grace's attic. It reads, "Reverend Lovell took me to the cellar, said I needed God, said he'd show me what remained of our daughter and cure me of fantasy. He opened the trapdoor with the key only he kept. He showed me where the chains were broken, not by force, by decision." She stepped out, walked to the very center, and sang once. He said I imagined it. But I watched him cover his ears. I watched him bleed from the nose. I watched him hum the same notes in his sleep for 5 nights after. I told him I'd go no further, that I would not be taught. He struck me, but I stayed still, because I knew the real horror wasn't what she'd become. It was that she was not alone in that chamber. There were others, not bodies, voices, waiting for her to teach them the last line. And now I hear it too. It isn't a song. It's a lesson plan. After Grace's final letter, she disappeared from public record. No obituary, no grave. But one city ledger notes that on May 2nd, 1879, a woman matching her description was admitted briefly to Bellevue Sanatorium, listed only as Grace L. Her condition: persistent auditory delusions with tonal echolalia. She was discharged 6 days later, reportedly cured. Bellevue burned to the ground in 1881. Nothing of its archives survived, but a single page was found among the ashes, soot-marked and torn. On it, 5 musical notations and a phrase written in reverse. "The lesson is not for us. We are only the choir." In 1961, a group of researchers attempting to catalog forgotten women of the 19th century came across Grace's letters during renovations of the Ashbrook parsonage. All but one were removed and archived. The final letter, the one referencing the chamber, the commands, and the unnamed voices, vanished before cataloging. But copies existed. One went to Dr. Ruth Fenley, a psychoacoustic linguist at Columbia University. She attempted to recreate the 5-note sequence described in the commands. She played it once. Her assistant, who had not heard the piece directly, began humming it 3 hours later. That night, Ruth left 47 voicemails on her own office line. All humming, no speech. Each voicemail exactly 1 minute apart. She was found the next morning unconscious, hands pressed against the wall, eyes closed. And on her whiteboard, written over and over again, "Chain the center, close the mouth, do not echo." In the next part of this story, we return to Reverend Lovell himself, the man who chained his own daughter beneath a church built on a tuning chamber. His sermons were erased from the record. His Bible was marked with notes no theologian has been able to decipher, and in his final years he began preaching not to the living, but to someone buried just beneath the floor. Reverend Elias Lovell's final years were not spent in silence, but in isolation, muttering sermons no one heard, to a congregation that did not breathe. After Grace vanished, neighbors reported strange behaviors. The Reverend no longer held services. He stopped accepting visitors. Yet every Sunday, the bells of Ashbrook rang out, followed by the sound of Lovell's voice echoing through the empty chapel. The doors were locked, windows shuttered, but if you stood close enough, you could hear him. He wasn't preaching from Scripture anymore. He was answering questions. In 1880, a local carpenter named Orville Denshaw was hired to reinforce the church foundation after a series of unexplained tremors. He noted something strange. The pulpit had been moved, not forward toward the congregation, but backward, closer to the floor. Denshaw also found a carved circle beneath the carpet, one not noted in any plans. He described it as a perfect spiral made of inlaid wood and iron, worn down at the center by years of standing, or kneeling. Reverend Lovell had changed the layout of the church to speak directly into the floor. What he was saying, no one knew. But a visiting deacon from New York named Samuel McTavish, who managed to gain entry during a Tuesday morning delivery, recalled seeing Lovell mid-sermon, alone, eyes closed, hands pressed to the altar, humming softly. The deacon described the melody as haunting, not discordant, but purposefully wrong, like an equation that almost balances, then folds in on itself. McTavish left abruptly. He never returned. But he wrote a short letter to his superior before resigning from the clergy. "I saw a man praying into a mouth he buried, and I saw the mouth open back." That same year, Lovell's personal Bible was discovered to be defaced, though annotated may be more accurate. Many pages were unmarked, but others had lines underlined in ink that did not match any found in the region at the time. A copper-like pigment, reactive to heat and prone to bleeding through paper. Next to passages from Job and Ecclesiastes were notations in what appeared to be Latin, but reversed, mirrored, or rendered phonetically in Greek letters. Linguists struggled to decipher them. A few scholars from the seminary in Lexington attempted translation. Their conclusion: the tongue of the deep has no vowels, only breath. Lovell's descent accelerated after that. The town physician, Dr. Harris Broom, visited in the spring of 1881 after neighbors reported animal bones piling near the chapel. He noted signs of malnutrition, possible delirium, and what he called spiritual aphasia. The Reverend no longer responded to his name. When asked simple questions, he answered in cryptic phrases. "The bell must stay broken. I told her 3 notes were enough. The floor remembers every footstep, even mine." Broom recommended institutional care, but the Reverend refused to leave. In June of that year, the bell in Ashbrook rang 13 times at midnight. No one was inside the church. Witnesses swore to it. Yet the sound echoed through the valley, deep, resonant, and slightly off tune. Some said it didn't fade like a normal bell. It lingered, folded in on itself, repeated. The next morning, Lovell was found collapsed at the altar. He was clutching his own throat, not in pain, but in silence. A gesture. His final sermon had been written on the back of a funeral bulletin from 1878, the week Eleanor was buried. Only one sentence appeared: "The tongue is not a flame, it is a match." Lovell died later that day, alone, but not peacefully. Records show he had scratched something into the wooden floor near the altar. Deep grooves, deliberate and rhythmic. Not words. Musical notation: 5 notes. A pause, 11 notes. A breath. The same sequence Eleanor had reportedly hummed in her final days. The town elders sealed the church, boarded it up, paid 2 men from Knoxville to dismantle the bell and bury it behind the cemetery wall. But the spiral remained, and the floor still bore the marks of something or someone moving beneath it. In the years following Lovell's death, Every child born within a half-mile of Ashbrook was recorded as having abnormal auditory development. Not deafness, not sensitivity, something else. Perfect pitch. Even when raised away from the area, these children were noted for reproducing tones without error. All of them, at some point, began humming the same 5-note sequence described by Lovell. No one knew why. Some were tested, others sent away. A few simply stopped speaking altogether. In 1896, a young seminarian named Elijah Kane returned to Ashbrook. Obsessed with Lovell's work, he reopened the church briefly as a study space. He claimed the structure had residual acoustics that helped him meditate. For a time, he lived in the back room. Then he vanished. But his journal remained. In it, Kane describes dreams of descending spirals, mouths without teeth, and voices teaching lessons backward. One passage stands out. She speaks in scales, not sentences. Her curriculum is breath and blood and resonance. Every room becomes a throat. Every sermon a requiem. I am learning. Kane's final entry was dated 3 days before his disappearance. It read, "The chain wasn't for her, it was for us." No one has entered Ashbrook Church since. Its doors are welded shut. The land declared unstable. But rumors persist, of music heard underground, of children who whistle at dusk and don't know why, of stones that vibrate faintly when placed on the chapel's altar. The Lovell Bible remains locked in an archival vault, but scholars continue to study its annotations. In the next chapter, we explore what may be the most disturbing discovery of all: Eleanor's original hymnal, recovered from a traveling minister's satchel in 1912. Its pages do not contain lyrics, only commands, and its final note: teach them to listen, then teach them to echo. The last attempt to enter Ashbrook Church was in 1976. A historical preservation team, sponsored by the state, arrived to assess the structure for potential restoration. Most of the town had forgotten it by then, forgotten the sermons, the chain, the silence that hummed beneath the floorboards. Forgotten, but not forgiven. The team was led by Dr. Hugh Malden, a structural engineer with a fascination for acoustics in old sanctuaries. With him were 2 graduate students, a sound technician, and a local guide named Doris Albright, whose grandmother, she claimed, had once played the chapel's pipe organ before it was removed. The team breached the front doors with little resistance. The boards were brittle, the lock rusted, but the air inside? It hadn't moved in decades. Doris was the first to note the sound. Not a voice, not a melody, a pressure. She described it as a listening, as if the space had ears and had just noticed it was no longer alone. The sanctuary was coated in dust, but untouched. No graffiti, no rodent droppings, not even cobwebs. Just a thick, weighted silence. Dense, unmoving, waiting. Then they found the floor. The spiral beneath the pulpit was still there. Metal and ash lacquered into wood. The boards around it were lighter, warped slightly outward, as if something beneath had pushed once, then never again. One of the students, Marla Trenton, lowered a contact microphone to the spiral's center. They waited. 10 seconds, 30, and then a vibration, soft, rhythmic. 2 pulses, a pause, 2 pulses again. The same sequence Eleanor had sung. The same one etched in the hymnal. The same one Reverend Lovell whispered before his death. Except this time, it responded. The waveform, recorded and analyzed back at the lab, showed a structure too regular to be random, too intentional to be dismissed. They hadn't recorded a sound. They'd recorded a call and response. Marla returned 3 days later, alone. She left behind a journal. One entry. It's not singing, it's remembering. It needs ears, it needs mouths, it needs us. After that, the state sealed Ashbrook permanently, welded steel bars across the doors, buried the records, denied the event. But the audio survived. For years, it circulated among private researchers. Most dismissed it as artifact noise. One, a young audiologist named Jonah Crane, claimed it wasn't a voice at all, but breath. Not one breath, multiple, layered, out of sync, breathing as if remembering how to be human. The sound clip was labeled Chain 40 Wave. In 1988, a retired choir teacher in Richmond, Virginia was hospitalized for erratic behavior. She had no history of mental illness, but neighbors said she had recently received a cassette tape in the mail, marked only with the word lesson. She played it once. Just once. Then she began painting the inside of her home black. Windows, mirrors, even light bulbs. She refused to speak during the day. At night, she hummed. One phrase, 5 notes, 11 notes, a breath. When she was committed, she left behind only one note. The voice inside me is not mine, but it waits for my lips. The origin of the tape was never confirmed, but forensic analysis revealed that the voice on the recording wasn't hers. It wasn't human at all. It contained frequencies outside the normal vocal range, frequencies aligned with certain species of deep-sea mammals. Yet the cadence? Human. The language? Recognizable. One analyst working independently translated a sequence from the background noise using phonetic mapping. It said, "The girl in chains is not dead. She is suspended. We ring her like a bell." In 2001, a small group of amateur historians reopened a corner of the Ashbrook Cemetery seeking proof of Eleanor Lovell's burial. But when they unearthed the plot marked with her name, they found something else entirely. An empty coffin. Chains inside, but no body. Pressed into the lid, facing inward, were deep gouges, 10 of them. 5 per hand. Not frantic, not random. Measured, as if counting. What followed over the next several years was a sharp increase in unexplained auditory phenomena across central Virginia. Children reported voices humming during sleep. Local dogs refused to pass the Ashbrook grounds. Birds avoided the steeple. And in 2009, a field recorder left outside the property captured a 43-minute soundscape of wind, creaking trees, and underneath it all, the sound of chains being lifted. No clinking, no dragging, just the shift, the release of tension. Like something finally free. The audio file was submitted to 2 universities for analysis. Neither responded. But anonymous online communities took notice. A subreddit devoted to acoustic hauntings claimed to have decoded the underlying signal. A sentence, played backward, layered beneath the metal scrape. If she sings, we must answer. Then, in 2017, a letter was published anonymously in a now-defunct zine called The Breath Below. The author claimed to be a descendant of Reverend Lovell. He, or she, shared a final warning. They chained her not because she was cursed, but because she remembered. The church was never a prison. It was a rehearsal space. If she finds her tone again, she will not sing alone. We will hum beside her. We always do. That's what faith is. The letter ended with coordinates. They point to the exact center of the spiral in Ashbrook Church. Nothing has happened there in decades. But if you stand close enough on a still night, with your breath held and your heart quiet, you might feel the air shift. Not wind, not breath, recognition. Because Eleanor was never the monster. She was the vessel, the rehearsal, the echo that taught others to resonate. The chains weren't to hold her. They were to remind her what happens when you sing too loud, too true. She was a lesson. And now, the lesson is humming again. Do you hear it? Or worse, are you beginning to hum along?